while camping in Australia by Enigmia. Camping has always had the potential to be kind of creepy. I love it. Being alone in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a tent between me and the elements. I find it incredibly refreshing to get away from the rest of humanity like that. Yet, I would be the first to admit that in being so isolated, it can easily go from calm and relaxed to panicked and expecting death. But it is worth it, and I take all the safety precautions I can. My family knows my travel plans, up-to-date maps, and I also check in via satellite phone on the regular. I hire a recently serviced vehicle that has spare wheels, spare fuel, extra water, and all the rest that I have, such as medical supplies. So, I'm pretty well equipped. I also do a whole lot of research, so I know the area. Mostly the weather, the politics and local flora and fauna. I was travelling to spider-infested Australia this time, so I had to take particular care on this trip. I make a bit of money as a freelance nature photographer, so I was hoping the spring season would let me get some good shots of the wildlife. But despite feeling pretty organised, despite never having had any major problems while camping in the past there is one more thing I will never neglect looking back on it again. Local folklore. Right, yeah. Laugh if you want, but let me tell you about my camping time in the Australian outback. It had been a rough day of driving. I felt like every one of my joints was compressed from the Land Rover bouncing over rough, irregular tracks, and the weather had been particularly hot that day, even more so than usual. 4 days into my 2-week trek across the desert, I was sunburnt, blistered and covered in little bites from gnats and mosquitoes, with no amount of sun cream or insect repellent seeming to protect me against this. I considered it was all worth it though. The landscape is spectacular, like nothing I've ever seen before. When I stopped for lunch, there was some views of the red earth land that was so flat you could see for miles, uninterrupted by anything but the low growth of grasses and the occasional tree. I could make out one distant peak. It definitely wasn't a mountain, but I could hesitantly say it was a hill. It must have been less than 500 feet high, but it stood out in the otherwise flat landscape. I decided to drive towards it and camp nearby. I could try getting normal phone reception from the top as well and take some great photos of the desert at sunset. I arrived at its base, and it was late afternoon, so I set up my tent on the flat. The soil was very hard, but I had to gather my gear to prepare to climb the hill. It was relatively easy to scramble up. I had changed into trousers before leaving despite the heat because the temperature always drops so suddenly in the desert. I was somewhat grateful for this later, as my knees were somewhat protected as I hauled myself over rocks and through thorny bushes. My hands were stained from that same bright red soil by the time I neared the top, and I suspected the rest of me was too. Now, there was no regular cell reception, but I wasn't worried. I still had the satellite phone if I needed it. The top made for a great vantage point for pictures, but the sun was still a little while off from that beautiful dusky lighting, so I had to look around. Now, the hill was mostly barren, but there were small rocky areas that had some suburbs growing from them. There were some other nice plants in the slightest of cracks. On the far side I discovered a small hole of a cave. It was narrow at the mouth of this, but it got much wider as you went in. I decided to stomp and make some sound just to try and figure out if there was any wildlife in there. I didn't hear any sound though in response. Crouching down, I decided to shuffle in. It smelt sour like rotting meat. My boots knocked against something solid which clattered away like cutlery. I clicked on my torch and I saw it was a pile of bones, ranging vastly in size. They looked recent and were not entirely devoid of flesh. Disgusting. I covered my mouth and nose with my hand and quickly swung the light around to assure myself I was alone. Native wild dogs, I suspected. Dingoes. They're nocturnal and already out hunting for the night. There were bones scattered throughout the cave, sometimes at random, sometimes in small piles, as well as particularly well-eaten animal carcasses. These all belonged to small animals though. There were also some depressions in the dust indicating that there must have been animals laying there at some point. I decided not to linger, knowing my scent would already cause the dingoes to return. Although, like any dog, I knew dingoes could be vicious, though I wasn't very worried about camping so close. They all looked very well fed and they weren't the type of animal to pick fights with humans unprovoked. Once I got back outside, I did manage to get some good shots of a wedge-tailed eagle, as well as some shots of the sun setting over the desert plains. I had expected to see more wildlife. This was the least populated part of the desert so far. Apart from the carcass in the cave, I hadn't seen any mobs of kangaroos, nor had I managed to get any shots of flocks of birds or anything like that. It wasn't very good for photography that day. It seemed that here, even the flies and ants weren't pestering me. It was so peaceful though, laying back on a rock, watching the stars emerge one by one, knowing that I was the only human for hundreds of miles, desolate, in the nearly uninhabitable expanses of wilderness that follow in every direction and make you feel like you're on another planet. It can make me uneasy at times, but it mostly feels liberating to be so isolated, and I was so happy. Eventually I had to climb down before I lost all visibility. Night had fallen like a blanket. This had painted the once illuminated landscape in shades of grey and navy. I had left an electric lantern on at my table during the night with no obstructions on the plain, so it would be very easy to get back to the car in the dark. As I walked, I occasionally lost my footing on loose stones or in the burrows of animals. I saw the lantern fall from the table in the distance. No, it didn't fall. It faced upwards before falling to the ground. The light was going dim. Those things are heavy and hard. It would be difficult for the wind to knock it over, let alone pick it up and drag it with such force to break it. I stood there, poised in the dark. It wasn't pitch black. The light from the stars and the silver of a moon illuminated the outline of the car, where the metal glinted off, and behind me, there was a hill which was a dark mass of looming, impending shadows. I picked up the pace and started jogging as carefully as I could. I considered waving my arms, yelling, shining my torch, anything that I could to frighten away any dingoes that might still be lingering around, but I really didn't want to aggravate them. Besides, I couldn't see any signs of movement in my campsite. This was confirmed when I arrived. Apart from the lantern, nothing was disturbed. But the lantern... It looked like it had been crushed underfoot by something, but it would have taken a massive amount of weight to have achieved that. A second later, I nearly jumped out of my skin. In the distance, the most bone-chilling sound I have ever heard reverberated through the night, high-pitched, undilated cries rising and falling in massive chorus. I was already jittery, so it took me a second to realise it must have been the dingoes howling. But they sounded so distant, when surely they had been in my campsite only moments before. Nothing could move that quick. The cold, still night air carried the calls from what sounded like miles away. Hair stood up on the back of my neck, and the long howls only added to my growing anxiety. I did several things then. I made sure I had my car keys in my pocket, and I dragged my sleeping bag out of the tent and made room for it on the back seat to sleep in there. At least the car would block out the sound of the dogs better than the tent would. I then climbed onto the roof of my car and adjusted my spotlight I had attached. It was good for providing emergency light, and I often used it to look for the animals' eyes during the night. Usually, I enjoyed this interaction with nature, but this night, I was already nervous. With some trepidation, I moved the beam of light around the clearing, straining my eyes for any glint of reflection that would indicate the presence of another creature. I thought there was nothing, but the very top of the light caught something, so I briefly wondered if I had imagined it, I swung the beam higher and higher beyond the top of the height of a dingo, far beyond even the height of a human, and I saw it. 2 milky white, perfectly round dots in the dark. I was frozen stiff with shock until they tilted suddenly. I jumped. The spotlight jerked to one side with me when I saw more of the eyes. These ones were close enough that I could even make out the shadows. It was very lanky and looked like its arms were just too long. With light on them, they too jerked their head as though they looked at me, eyes glittering back at me. I turned off my light instantly. It was so stupid, but all I could think was that I didn't want to see them anymore. The darkness embraced me even more. Now my eyes had fully grown accustomed to the bright lights. I was blinking, desperately trying to get my eyes to differentiate any movement nearby, while simultaneously dreading seeing anything at all. In the distance, a howl cut off abruptly. Now, my own ragged breathing was the only sound. Strange, because usually the nights are alive with the sounds of insects chirping. With a sudden rush of adrenaline and an instinct warning to me, I moved myself to the roof of the car and managed to position myself where that I didn't have to climb down, and I was able to throw myself to get off quicker. I hit the ground hard on one shoulder, staggering upright, and started fumbling for my keys. I once again heard them strange sounds in the distance and somewhat nearby. I then struggled to open the door and I heard a ripping sound. I didn't have to turn around to know it was by my tent and that was what was being shredded. With my lungs straining, heart pounding, and the contents of my stomach rolling immersively in my belly, I jammed the key into the ignition, started the engine to my car. The headlights blinked on. There was nothing in front of my car. My relief didn't last though. As I was trying to see if there was anything else around me, I began hearing the shredding sound from straight behind me. I realised then that it was the metal of my Land Rover. I yanked the gearbox, fumbled to get the car into drive while simultaneously looking in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see anything past the luggage I had piled up on the roof and in the boot, but the scraping from the back of the vehicle continued, like something was trying to get inside. When I then heard the sound of glass smashing, I finally slammed my foot onto the accelerator and began to hurl myself away from the direction that I had initially came from. It wasn't long before I nearly rolled the car as the right hand side dipped into a deep crack at very high speed. I swerved by some luck, managing to regain control, slowed my pace considerably. I never had to exert more self-control over myself. Every instinct was telling me to keep moving as fast as possible, but more rationally, I knew that I was getting out in one piece and that was what was important. Every time I glanced into the mirrors, I expected to see something pursuing me. I just drove through the night, hands gripping the wheel like vices, jumping at the silhouettes of every tree. Eventually, dawn did break though, and I could see what I'd been looking for. A fence indicating a nearby cattle station I'd stopped at to refill my water the previous morning. I then drove up to the property. The owner was bundled up in a woolen jumper, leaning back on the steps with a hot coffee in hand. He then helped me as he saw that I practically fell out of my car. He then helped me get up, and I wasn't actually injured, and he realised this and sat me down at his kitchen table. He then added some stuff to his instant coffee and then reboiled the kettle without any further questions. Eventually I spoke. Something strange happened to me last night. Yeah. I was taken back by his response. It wasn't a question, it was an assumption. It was just a casual acceptance. You strayed fast west. Maybe. The track wasn't that distinct. Nah, you did for sure. Quincan territory. Excuse me, what territory? Now, I'd already encountered my fair share of Australian sarcasm in my trip, so I wasn't 100% certain I wasn't being teased. My people don't go there, haven't for thousands of years. Quincan spirits just cause far too much mischief, he he shrugged. I saw these human things that were tall and thin. He was nodding. I still felt so shaken, and the echoes of my metal being ripped was ringing through my ears. He passed me a coffee and left the room. A while later, when my coffee was almost gone, he come back with a photo of some cave drawings. Something like that. "You're right," I told him. I still couldn't believe I was actually having this conversation. Speaking of caves, I have found a dingo cave too on a hill, full of dead animals. Animals? Bones or them? No, just bits of them. Dingoes wouldn't leave meat on a carcass. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, unsure of how to reply. "Thanks for the coffee. I should probably go and check out the damage done to my car and get going." "Damage?" "Yeah, I reckon one of those things, or whatever you call them, had to go up my tent and the rover. It scared me half to death anyhow." "Quinken," he corrected me automatically, then went silent. He watched me carefully for a minute before picking up the empty mugs and putting them on the sink. He ran his hands through his curly dark hair and then shook his head. "Doesn't sound like them. They're good spirits. I'll check out your car." We went outside and looked. The spare wheel, metal casing and all had been ripped off, the window was smashed, and the boot door hung silently crooked on its hinges, and half of my luggage must have fallen out as I drove. There were broad claw marks and scratches through the paint on the panel on the right side hand that was very deep and fully penetrates the metal. "I don't think it was a dingo. Do you think it was one of those things?" "Quinkens wouldn't do this. They're cheeky but helpers. They might have been trying to warn you." "Warn me about what?" I asked him, after hesitating to decide whether I wanted to know after all. "Toramili, I reckon. He's like him but different. My grandfather said when the ground shakes and the animals feel, you know that he's near. You are one lucky fella. You're lucky that he was more interested in the tent than you." He then ran his hands through the dents on the car. It was shocking how small his fingers looked compared to those. "What is?" He cut me off, putting a hand on my shoulder, looked me dead in the eyes, and expressed something that was almost as serious as a heart attack. "I'd reckon he's got your scent though. You better get a move, mate." I had decided to not ask any more questions. I felt immediately scared and kept driving back the original way I'd come from until I intersected a highway. From there, I then went to the nearest city and booked a plane flight to cut my trip short. The local indigenous people knew something about that hill, knowledge that saw them and their ancestors today not giving that place a wide breath. Who better to learn the dangers of the land other than from those who live in it? Next time I camp, I'm going to be far more mindful of ancient warnings, and I'd recommend that you do the same. Hello everyone, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video then please give it a like. I actually found this story while researching my current video, and I thought it was such a good story that I'd just get it out quickly now for you all so you could also enjoy it. I don't actually mind doing creepypastas, so I might actually do them just once a week, but I'm not really sure. Just let me know what you all think. And yeah, I'm just about to go straight back to finishing the work on my current video, so that's going to be out either tonight or tomorrow, but make sure you have notifications turned on so you'll get notified when I actually upload it. As always, have a nice day everyone, and I'll be talking to you soon. Take care.